Hello and welcome to the Japan Seminar at UC San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schede. I'm the director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy. GPS is an international relations and public policy school with a focus on the Pacific Rim. Among our various degree programs, we have a Master's of International Affairs, an MIA, with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our program offerings, please go to gps.ucsd.edu. At GPS, we have JFIT, the Japan Center. It's a center for research, education, information, and connections across the Pacific between San Diego and Japan. If you're interested in our center activities, please visit jfit.ucsd.edu. We have a newsflash at JFIT that you can subscribe to if you go to our website and click the news and media button. It's a bi-weekly summary, or not summary, addition to what you read in the news, the stories that we think are important that are not covered in your daily perusal of other large news outlets. And while I have your attention, let me also ask you to help us if you can. We would, of course, like to do this in person and meet in a classroom at GPS in San Diego. And if you were to join us there, you would have to drive your car and park your car and put your credit card into that parking meter. And we would just be so grateful if you could consider sharing just a few dollars with us. If everybody online here does that, we can actually continue this program. We have already received support from some of you, and we're exceedingly grateful for that. If you'd like to consider helping us, either contact me directly or go to jfit.ucsd.edu/support. Right there. Our Zoominar is a bi-weekly event, and of course today we're going to talk about Japan and China, and I'm going to introduce my colleagues shortly. Let me just, while I have your attention, point out that next week we are going to talk about SoftBank and the Japanese IT industry. Those of you who read the newsflash know that I've been following SoftBank very closely, and every 2 weeks we have a SoftBank corner. But in all the news of SoftBank, what's actually covered up is the critical role of NTT in Japan, and NTT Data, which is Japan's most global IT company. If you want to learn more about all of that, join us next week, and then we'll discuss immigration policies in December. Our events will also continue into next year, so stay tuned. Alrighty then, with all of that, let me stop my share and introduce my sparring partners today. I have two wonderful guests, Professor Hiroki Takeuchi from SMU and Victor Shih, my colleague here at GPS. So let me begin with introducing Professor Takeuchi. He is Associate Professor of Political Science at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. He's also the director of the Sun and Star program on Japan and East Asia in the SMU Tower Center. Professor Takeuchi has a BA in economics from Keio University, an MA in Asian studies from UC Berkeley, go Bears, and a PhD in political science from UCLA, go Bruins. So you got the all Bear family covered there. He has 3 books, including Tax Reform in Rural China, and a book in Japanese on China, on the current state of the party system in China, and an earlier edited volume on Taiwan at a turning point. He also has a variety of articles. His research interest is global value chains and how they affect trade agreements and inter-country relationships. So he's a perfect person to ask about Japan-China business relations. And my second guest today is Victor Shih, my colleague here. He is Associate Professor in Ho Mu Lam Chair in China and Pacific Studies at GPS at UC San Diego. In fact, we are office mates. His office is right next to mine. And sometimes, Victor, when you advise students on their MA thesis, I can't help but listen to how you teach them. And I must say that usually that's much more interesting than whatever it is that I'm doing at that point. And I've learned a lot from you over the years by listening in to those office hours. You've joined GPS in 2012, so we've been neighbors for quite a while. You have a BA from George Washington University in East Asian Studies and a PhD from Harvard in Government, Comparative Political Economy. In the past, you've also taught at Northwestern, and you've been for a year the principal of the global market strategy of the Carlyle Group, a PE fund that was apparently interested in what you know about China. And that's because you are an authority on Chinese banking policies, fiscal policy, exchange rate, and debt. And you were one of the first people to call out the looming debt issue. So with that, thank you both for joining. It's great to have you. And so let me motivate what we're doing here today. As those of you who've seen my book know, I argue that so my book is really about the business reinvention, and that is actually a reaction to the rise of China. That Japan lost its competitive advantage in making high quality, mass-produced consumer gadgets to first South Korea and then Taiwan and then China. And as a result, Japan has positioned upstream and now anchors the Asian trade technologically. And indeed, if we look at the situation from the Japanese perspective, China is now by far the largest trading partner and also the largest Japanese business place in terms of offices outside of Japan. And because Japan has moved upstream into high-tech, deep-tech areas, and China is the king of manufacturing and assembly, the two actually have a symbiotic relationship in trade. That's what I argue. And I want you to kind of pull that apart today, if you wish. That is, given, even in spite of all the history and the struggles and, what, do they like each other? Do they not like each other? When it comes to money and trade, they're pretty pragmatic and mercantilist around that. China needs Japan, Japan needs China, so let's trade. And so then came the United States and the decoupling and the trade wars. And that threw sort of a wrench in a large number of things until last thing we heard was 2 weeks ago, new trade agreements are popping up in Asia. RCEP, which is ASEAN plus 5 countries in East Asia, have struck a massive tariff reduction deal with China, with Japan, with Korea. And then, of course, Xi Jinping last week signaled that he might be quite interested in joining and having China join the TPP, which is also very interesting given that the US is not part of that deal currently, right? So let's put this all up for discussion. What is the relationship between Japan and China? What does China want? What does Japan want? How do we want to look at this in terms of the relation also with the United States? So Victor, why don't you start us out? You know China party politics, Chinese elites, Chinese, what China wants. So yeah, you brought a few slides. So why don't you walk us through a few points on the Japan-China relation?
Great. First of all, thank you, Hiroki, for inviting me. Unfortunately, I have not learned nearly as much from you as you might have learned from me, although I doubt that I imparted too many genuine insights while I'm talking to my students. As you know, I tend to just, blabber my mouth nonstop when my students are in my office. But I think this, issue of U.S. And China and Japan is very interesting and important issue, obviously, for the future of Asia Pacific. I also look forward to learning from Hiroki, who is much more of a kind of a trade specialist than I am. I will have one slide on trade, but I will basically claim that I don't know at all what's behind it. I will probably talk a bit more about China's strategic intentions, and I've developed some metrics for that. And then finally, just some very preliminary, trade statistics again, which, again, it's open to interpretation by real experts like Hiroki, and some implications. So I just want to present 3 kind of graphs, or facts, if you will, but just graphs. So one is that according to official Chinese data, so this is from the Chinese government, this is the China-Japan trade balance at the end of the year. And of course, for 2020, we only have October data. So it goes up to October. So as you can see, back in 2010 or before that, Japan ran a, sort of a sizable trade surplus vis-a-vis China, 50 billion. So the units are in millions of US dollars. So $50 billion in 2010, that shrank to nearly zero by 2015, has come back up a little bit by 2018, but then began to decline again. I'm not sure why. So overall, I would say the direction is toward more or less kind of a trade balance over time. And maybe Hiroki can tell us more about that maybe trend. But that is consistent with some of the things that I will say later on about, even though Japan, of course, has tried to occupy the higher end of the value chain, China also is trying very hard to do the same thing. And in fact, I've heard, Chinese government officials explicitly tell me that they are trying to grab market shares from Germany, Japan, and South Korea. And basically they recognize that they will lose, obviously, the light manufacturing market share to Vietnam and, Thailand and countries like that. But the way that China will try to maintain a trade surplus, a sizable trade surplus, is to grab market share from the US, of course, but also actually, especially from Germany, Japan, and Korea, who excel in this kind of heavy machinery, electronics, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we know that the Chinese leadership is very focused on, moving up the value chain for Chinese exports? So here, with the help of someone in the audience, actually Mark in the audience, helped me gather this data. But we basically gather the press releases of all the available, what I call elite policy meetings. So elite policy meetings are meetings attended by more than one Politburo member of the Chinese Communist Party. And then I divide up what they discuss into kind of 50 different economic policy areas. And additionally, also like another 50 non-economics, but for this talk, I just focus on the economic policy areas. And for the big data, smart manufacturing, and also scientific research, you can see that actually consistently, so these are kind of like the two darker blue lines here. Sorry, they're all blue, so it's kind of hard to tell them apart. The darker blue lines consistently sort of every half-year segment, so these are more or less half-year segments, 30 to 40% of all elite policy meetings would discuss big data, smart manufacturing, and or scientific research and innovation. Right? So this is clearly, they're spending a lot of time talking about it. Of course, there was a big dip in the first half of 2020, and the lighter blue line, which is COVID-19, took over, the entire elite agenda. But you can see that by the second half, and this is data up to October 1st of 2020, COVID discussion dropped, but then discussion on scientific research and big data, smart manufacturing climbed back to the 30 to 40% range, right? So once again, occupied a very important space in the minds of Xi Jinping and other members of the Politburo. So a good kind of contrast is regional development, which is, kind of infrastructure investment. That traditionally, of course, is very important, but its importance have dropped in recent years, whereas discussion on smart manufacturing and scientific innovation has kept in this kind of 30 to 40% range throughout the entire period. And, if we do some more analysis on at the ministerial level, so, at the Politburo level, obviously, the policies are kind of vague, and, we want China to have strategic independence when it comes to integrated circuits and stuff like that. Then typically what happens is that the spirit of these high level decisions get passed on to the ministries. like the Ministry of Information, or Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, or the National Development and Reform Commission, and they come up with specific subsidies, specific policies to fulfill the spirit of decisions made at the Politburo level or by one of these leading groups that Xi Jinping heads. So we've seen obviously a lot of new policies rolled out, on the IT sector, on IC specifically, on EVs, et cetera, et cetera. And some of that could be working, right? So if you look at the year-on-year increase in exports in different categories, again, this is official Chinese data, so take it with a grain of salt. Exports of mechanical and electrical products enjoy this kind of growth squirt, I guess, 2017 to 2018, and then it dropped to a low level of growth in 2019 for some reason. But what's really interesting, and I have a paper on this, which I'll have to show Hiroki when it's actually done, on the integrated circuit export, is that has been a massive leader on the margin for Chinese tech export. So if you look at the lighter blue line, which is Chinese IC exports, it was growing at 30% a year in 2018, 2019. Of course, at the beginning of this year, it dropped, but it very quickly recovered and is now seeing a growth rate of 10, 15%. I actually don't even know, I should look at the data because I do have the data, where this IC is being exported to. Is it Southeast Asia? Is it part of process trade or whatever? In any event, if you look at the overall Chinese trade surplus, which of course is very healthy this year, already year to date, close, I think it's probably above 300 billion US dollars. A large contributor has been IC export, integrated circuit exports, which is, the way that Chinese leadership talks about it is sort of aspirational. But to some extent, if you just look at the trade data, they have arrived because China is making a lot of IC. Of course, there's a lot of debate about the quality and all this kind of stuff, and they're exporting it. And then so just some implications, I think the Chinese leadership is very focused on import substitution and enlarging export for Chinese tech, especially in IT and big data. The leadership is also interested in maintaining a healthy trade surplus. And the way that they think about it is not so much, as a share of GDP, which obviously is not getting bigger and bigger over time. That would be impossible, almost impossible, given how large the Chinese economy is. But they would like to see this, $200 to $500 billion a year trade surplus in absolute amount. And the way they see it is more as a share of their foreign exchange reserve, right? So if they can keep the trade surplus at, 200 to 500 billion, then even if on the financial accounts they have outflows of, 200, 300 billion dollars, it wouldn't be so bad. And indeed, we've seen this play out as kind of a cushion for China's foreign exchange reserve over the past 5 years. So even with US and other Western measures against Chinese IT products, China is still achieving import substitution and export gains. If you look at the aggregate level data, so, the US policies, I think they have achieved something. It's unclear to me what it has. I mean, some of the industries have moved out of China into other countries, things like that. But overall, it has not stopped, the growth of Chinese exports in the tech sector overall. So, the last thing I think, all of us will think about is, I think countries in Asia must consider how the fulfillment of Chinese policy objectives, i.e. the Chinese dominance in a large number of tech sectors and Chinese net export to the rest of the world in those sectors, how that will impact their positions in the global production chain and also on domestic and international security. And with that, I very much look forward to what Hiroki has to say. I'll stop sharing, actually.
Well,
Okay.
thank you, Victor. So that was China, and China wants to be big, and so that's and successful, and that we did great. So now let's see how that fits into the larger context. So, Professor Takeuchi, please, the microphone is yours.
Okay. So, Eureka, thank you for your invitation. I'm glad to be with you and Victor together. I have known both of you, but usually I have seen you in different places. But I'm working on both China and Japan, so I'm very glad to see you both in this webinar. So today, so I'd like to talk about the implications of China-Japan business interactions on overall international relations, or especially international economic relations of the Asia Pacific. So the first thing I'd like to emphasize is United States, especially under Trump administration, has given a pressure to US allies, including Japan, for decoupling with China. But the first point I would like to make is decoupling is impossible. And I would say it is suicidal for the Japanese economy. So comparing Japan and the US for the economic interactions with China, Japan is connected with China through global value chains more than US does connect with China. So United States still, like, the largest item that US exports to China is actually soybeans. So US actually exports a lot of agricultural products. In the meantime, Japan also similar to Germany and South Korea, the most of the products Japan is exporting to China is manufactured products. And the manufactured products are based on the global value chains. So Japan is more interdependent with China and than the United States. The second reason decoupling is impossible for Japan is Japanese multinational corporations in China, they are doing very well, and then their business, their production has already recovered, even though under the current COVID circumstances. And especially auto and machinery sectors, their production has already recovered in China. And then third, actually most importantly, what is going on right now in East Asia, including China, probably at the center, with China at the center, is not decoupling, but recoupling of the global value chains. And I think that the recoupling that is going on in East Asia is the engine, and will be the engine of the post-COVID recovery. So if United States is really obsessed with decoupling with China, then the US may be left behind for the recovery of the economy after COVID. So that's actually the first point I'd like to make. The second point is the importance of so-called China plus one strategy that Japanese companies are taking. So Japanese government announced that they will give subsidies to a Japanese company which open a new plant or new facility in Japan, coming back from China. So the assumption was they will close the facility in China and then move it to Japan. So, but it seems that the Japanese companies found the optimal strategy to be like keeping the facility in China and then opening new facility in Japan using the subsidies. So here is an example, company called Iris Oyama. And Iris Oyama is an interesting company that is, they are producing masks, medical equipment, as well as electronic products. So they are producing so many products, so many kinds of products And so Iris Oyama received the subsidies from the Japanese government. And then in July, they opened a new line to produce masks in a Kakuda plant in the Miyagi prefecture in Japan. They invested $30 million, and then 3/4 of that investment was covered by the subsidies. But there is no evidence that Iris Oyama closed any facility in China. So they have a very big plant in Suzhou and Dalian, and neither of them was closed. And actually, they have a plan for opening a new plant in Tianjin in 2021, so next year. And then that plan was not canceled. And then also this month on November 1st, they opened a new office in Thailand. And then their plan is that like a new office in Bangkok is not only the center for sales, but also for in the future, the facility of production, especially producing the parts for their electronic products. So they have facilities so part suppliers in Thailand, Vietnam, and Taiwan, and then they are supplying parts from Thailand, Vietnam, and Taiwan to China and the United States. So that's actually so the China plus one, and then like Iris Oyama, Japanese companies find China plus one to be the optimal strategy under the pressure of decoupling, so-called. But then what Japanese companies are doing is diversifying global value chains. And then by diversification of global value chains, actually global value chains have been strengthened. So that's actually the second point. And then the third point is actually what Eureka said at the beginning, that's RCEP. So RCEP is ASEAN plus 5. And actually I took, when I wrote the note for today's speech, I mistakenly wrote ASEAN plus 6. Actually one country dropped, unfortunately, India dropped at the a few months ago. So it was very unfortunate. But on November 15th, those like 10 ASEAN countries plus 5 countries, Japan, South Korea, China, Australia, and New Zealand signed the agreement. So there are 2 kinds of big free trade agreement now in Asia Pacific. So one is TPP or CPTPP, and then the other is RCEP. And then these 2 free trade agreements are quite different. And then they are very different, so they can like coexist. So nowadays, the free trade agreement is rulemaking for global value chains based trade. So in order to promote global value chains based trade, what is important is promoting the foreign direct investment by multinational corporations. And then what they care most about is a regulation of by the domestic government. So many of the rules stipulated by TPP are actually not the tariffs, but actually domestic regulations. And so that's why the TPP is called very high level free trade agreement, because most of the rules are domestic regulations, and that they promote the domestic economic reform. And then that is why China finds it very difficult to join the TPP, and then China is not a member of the CPTPP. Although recently President Xi Jinping expressed their interest in the membership of the TPP, but we'll see. But the RCEP, which is led by China, is different. So because it is like led by China, China doesn't want to be committed to a domestic regulatory reform. So it is mainly focusing on tariffs. So tariffs among the developed countries, they are already very low. However, tariffs among the developing countries are quite high. So it's still meaningful because both CPTPP and RCEP include quite a few developing countries. So that their tariff rate will go down with the agreement of RCEP. So that's why I say that it was very unfortunate that India dropped. Because India's tariff rate was very high. So if India was in, then like that was it would have a remarkable impact. So problem is United States is not a member of either of them. So it's kind of the United States is left out from the current trend of the rulemaking of global value chains based trade, although US is in the global value chains of the Asia Pacific. That's actually one big concern. The importance of ASEAN and the Southeast Asian countries, importance of, in the context of China +1. That is reflected in the choice of the recent visit of Prime Minister Suga. The Prime Minister Suga, after inaugurating, he chose Vietnam and Indonesia as the two places, the first, the destinations of his first visit to a foreign country. So that's actually it was very interesting choice. One reason is in East Asia, COVID impact is much less or much milder than the United States or Europe. But it's actually very symbolic, and then also it's meaningful. It has a certain implications why Prime Minister Suga chose Vietnam and Indonesia. So again, I come back to the original point. Here, what is going on in East Asia is a recoupling of global value chains in East Asia. And then I think it will be the engine of the post-COVID economic recovery. And then I think that the Biden administration should consider how to come back to those free trade agreements, rulemaking and of the global value chains based trade. Otherwise, United States will be left out of the economic recovery after COVID. So I will stop here.
Well, thank you very much, Hiroki. So you raised a number of good points. Let me just react to the first one. I think your example of the Iris Oyama, I'm not sure that that's necessarily a policy failure, right? So the idea here is simply to reduce the dependence. So to say, if we are single sourcing from China, we should have another place, so China +1. And so there were these multi-billion-dollar incentives that, by the way, the US government also gave US firms, right? Move out of China and reduce the dependence. So that part I find very interesting. And your point, though, is that what this China +1 does is it actually reinforces the trade flows all around Asia rather than undermining them. And so let's get back to the US in a moment, but I do have a few questions from the audience. And audience, please, by all means, type your questions into the Q&A and I will try to weave them into the conversation. So we're getting questions and actually mimicking my own about the TPP. And I have a question for both of you, actually. The first is for Victor, and that is, you're an expert on the Chinese elites and Communist Party politics and all that sort of thing. So do you really think that China can reform the SOEs and do what it takes to become a TPP member? And then following up on that question from Robbie and Mao, will the TPP folks even let China in? I mean, is this something that China can announce and then do, or do the existing members actually have some sort of veto rights where they could say, no, you can't come in? Will China be welcome? So Victor, maybe start with you. What's actually the probability that China can?
So yeah, it depends. I'm not an expert in the TPP, so Hiroki can tell us all the nitty gritty. But a couple of things, like if there are any provisions for not subsidizing state-owned enterprises or other domestic sort of champion firms, then there's almost no chance for China to adhere to that. And the reason is because there are, literally, at least two ministries whose job it is to subsidize domestic strategic industries, and they just sit around all day long thinking about all the different kinds of subsidies and help they can provide to firms in these strategic industries. And if China were to stop all of that action overnight, then all these two ministries would just have nothing to do. MIIT, which is kind of like MIDI in Japan back in the day. And also, to some extent, the NDRC, National Development and Reform Commission, they all have kind of a technology, investment side. So I don't see, so that part I find hard to believe. The legal part, I think China can nominally adhere to it. They can pass a law on, whatever intellectual property rights on, whatever, and they've made some moves toward that, but whether or not they're actually going to stick to it, the courts in China, you have to remember, they're completely controlled by the party. The party is controlled by Xi Jinping. And, if the party leadership would like to change something, the courts will completely go along with the party's decisions. And so there's no recourse. So the bottom line of that is, even if they nominally say yes, down the road, a Chinese company or the Chinese government renege on the promise, there's no recourse within China for foreign counterparties. They can try to sue Chinese counterparties outside of China. And that actually is a potential way of trying to get Chinese firms and individuals to stick to some of these agreements, actually.
And so, Hiroki, you want to comment on the is China even welcome portion of that question?
Well, the shortest answer is actually yes. And if like China, so Victor is right. So the biggest reason why China does not want to be committed to any, so does not want to be or hesitates to be a member of the CPTPP is actually CPTPP is the first free trade agreement that stipulates the commitment to state-owned enterprise reform. So that's actually politically very difficult, if not impossible, in China currently. So so if China is qualified to be a member of TPP, which means China would have advanced state-owned enterprise reform very quickly. So that would be a good news for the Japanese company and Japanese government, and then also other countries, companies and government. So so overall, Japanese government and the Japanese would welcome China's interest in the TPP. But at the same time, how likely it is, that's actually a very good question.
So Saudi, our colleague at USC, has an interesting question that I don't know who wants to take this. She's wondering what the trajectory of China is. She wonders whether China will actually do sort of the Japanese thing, which is build a global production network, start in Asia. If you remember all the way back in the 1960s, Japan really started first of all by exporting, but then by building OTM plants in Thailand, and then go from Thailand to Europe and then the US. Do you think that China is going to pursue more of a techno-nationalism? Because that would then also affect what we do with these trade agreements, right? Or do you see a future where China will likewise sort of roll out the production machinery and have a global production network at the end of the day that would then change the logic of how we think about these trade agreements? Maybe again, Victor, you want to start from your vantage point?
So I'm not an expert in Yeah, Wei Yi is the expert in China's outward investment. But my impression, and you can tell me, Hiroki, if I'm right, is that to some extent China is trying to, or just not really trying, but just out of cost consideration, a lot of especially private firms have invested in some production facilities in Southeast Asia, especially, but also in places like Africa and even Latin America. And a lot of that is sort of private behavior, right? For light manufacturing, is just private investors. They find costs in China to be too high. And especially given some of these trade regimes where there's minimal tariffs and actually, by the way, the US tariff has been a bit of a push to this also for Chinese firms to invest in a non-China location so as to evade US tariffs. So that is happening. But whether it's going to be as extensive as, the relationship between Japan and China or Germany with Czech Republic and Poland remains to be seen. I mean, certainly I think for China, the advanced R&D, the bulk of the heavy industrial machineries, they still want that to be produced in China so as to maintain a trade surplus. If one day China has a complete dominance, let's say in integrated circuit, that will guarantee this kind of $200 to $500 billion in trade surplus for them every year, then they may well move some of this other lower tech, but still traditionally, tech related heavy industrial machinery production out of mainland China, out of cost considerations. That would be my guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, Hiroki, you want to
yeah.
add on that, or are we?
Yeah. So interesting thing is, so when we observe what Chinese leader like Xi Jinping says, it is actually sometimes it's self-contradictory. So Xi Jinping said China is interested in the membership of CPTPP. But at the same time, what Xi Jinping has been doing for last few years is really like strengthening state-owned enterprises. So what does it mean? Well, actually, there are like two goals that Xi Jinping or any Chinese leader has to pursue. That is, one is economic efficiency, economic development, economic growth, but the other is a party control. So that's actually authoritarian country and the one-party rule. That's actually probably the most important goal. So these two goals may be contradictory sometimes, right? So Xi Jinping's one of the policies was made in China 2025. And then that's actually probably what Saori says in techno-nationalism, and it suggests that. And then I don't think it will have a positive impact on the Chinese economic growth, because Chinese economic growth has been brought by the involvement in the global value chains. But the Made in China 2025 means like turning away from that kind of global value chains. So that's actually one of the examples of the self-contradiction. And then Xi Jinping tries to kind of balance. But I'm afraid that for last few years, at least, Xi Jinping really is giving the priority to party control over economic efficiency. Private companies are more efficient than state-owned enterprises. That's actually reality of the Chinese economy. But it's easier to control state-owned enterprises than the private enterprises. So it's we cannot give a definitive answer to it, but there is still still interest from the reformists for the structural reform of Chinese economy, and then so a point here is CPTPP or even RCEP or have a positive impact to empower or encourage China to be committed to economic reform.
So let's talk about the U.S. a little bit more because it's already become, you've mentioned several times, and certainly I have also been concerned that if the U.S. is so consumed with its own things and just thinks that Asia is only China and overlooks some of the important developments there, then the US might find itself just left behind. But how real is that decoupling really? I mean, there is still trade, right? And we are trading. Hiroki, I want to ask you, because you alluded to this in an earlier conversation, that there is the triangle, the trade triangle is alive and well. So share some of your observations of what you think is actually happening on the ground.
So
in terms of trade
decoupling is actually difficult even for the United States. It's so even like for example decoupling in 5G and the semiconductor. The Taiwanese company TSMC is opening a new plant in Arizona, and then that's actually a very big one. So decoupling is actually very difficult, and then like also for economic standpoint, it's better not to decouple. And then right now, even for the shortest term, like the COVID, for COVID, US is importing a lot of the surgical masks and then other products from China. And then what I found is when I talked with a person who is of Japan Airlines, who is in Dallas right now. So Japan Airlines is flying from Tokyo. So before COVID, there was daily flight from Haneda to the DFW. And they stopped operation in mid-April. But on May 1st, they resumed the daily flight for cargo flight. And in May, 90% of the cargo was actually surgical masks and the medical equipment. And then that was originated in China. So, so because many flights, most of the flights between US and China have been canceled. So they are actually carrying so Japanese airlines are carrying those like medical equipment from China to Tokyo, and then from Tokyo to the case of here, it's Dallas, and then it is distributed to all over the hospitals in all over the South. So that's actually the reality. So well, it's actually I cannot say more about the decoupling is actually almost impossible even for the United States.
Yeah, like those BYD masks.
And very few benefit from this, so it's not even clear how much of it.
Well, so I do have to say, on the other hand, though, what I have observed is that prior to all these tariffs on Chinese goods, all these economists are like, oh my God, if we have tariffs, the world is going to end tomorrow. And, guess what? The world didn't end. And there are costs, right? So to be sure, welfare was reduced across the board, in the US and in China. But pre-COVID, if you remember, it didn't have the kind of apparent economic impact in the US that a lot of people were predicting. So I think the Biden administration almost certainly will remove a lot of these tariffs. But whether they're going to remove everything, I don't know. Especially, so if you remember, like some of the tariffs were imposed on things that China doesn't even make yet. They're on their industrial policies, but China actually, China makes their passenger aircrafts, but they don't really export passenger aircrafts that much. But it's kind of this preemptive tariff, like, even if you were trying to export passenger aircrafts to the United States, there would be a heavy tariff on it. So that is not welfare reducing today. It's welfare reducing potentially in the future.
Yeah, so there's a question from Mark that I actually would take on. I think it's the same Mark who made your slides, a former student of ours. He's asking to what extent China's moving up the global value chain is a zero-sum game, and whether that comes at the expense of Germany, South Korea, and Japan. And I would say absolutely not. Because here's why: none of these countries or the companies in these countries are standing still, right? We're talking about very innovative areas where the Japanese companies in particular, but of course the Germans also, are heavily investing in R&D, and they have a 30-year head start on some of the chemicals that were, an issue that we've discussed earlier on this with the South Korea trade, and that China also needs. And so it is not a zero-sum game. If China gets better, then partially right now is that it'll just demand even better input parts from the other places and better machinery. The place that I'm worried about, and we talked about that 2 weeks ago in this place, is South Korea, because the way that the trade currently works is that Japan makes very high, deep technology, highly upstream chemicals and machinery equipment. That then goes to South Korea, and Taiwan, where it's put into input parts, made into input parts. So the chemicals are turned into input parts like screens or semiconductors. And they are then shipped to China, where the final product is built. And China, of course, is investing heavily into making these input parts itself, but it is behind. The place that is kind of potentially stuck in the middle is South Korea, where I'll invite some South Korea specialists in the future to figure this out. But clearly, this is not a zero-sum game, right? The decoupling is a zero-sum game, but having the value chains get better and better and better is just the future of our world. We're getting better at this stuff, right? And so it's not coming at the expense of Germany or Japan. Do you want to add to that, or you?
Well, I don't know nearly as much as you do, so I'm not going to say too much. But one thing that I know a little bit about is like the car industry. I think that's an interesting space to watch for, because I think the policies in China is this potentially a massive revolution toward EVs, which of course they've talked about it for many years. It hasn't happened, but now you really have this kind of indigenous, a few, looks to be pretty competitive indigenous producers of EVs, entirely indigenous, right? So NIOs and XPeng, and as well as some JVs, so, obviously BMW is doing that, and maybe some of the Japanese JVs doing that also. The danger is that it is such a large industry, right, for Germany, for Japan, and for China, that if the regulators feel comfortable enough with the wholly indigenous producers, they can just, flip the switch one day in terms of policy and just favor the domestic producers. And then what happens, right, to even some of the JVs? I mean, the JVs, the Chinese partner may lose out, but the Chinese partners can be compensated through subsidies, as you know, whereas the foreign partner can be left out in the cold, potentially.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to add that, Robbie said a very important point, so a denser network is more resilient. Right now under COVID, it's actually, global value chain, supply chains make the kind of production more fragile, but actually it's opposite. If the production facilities are connected all over the world, across the nations, across the borders, then that would make the network more resilient, and then it will stabilize the supply of the products. So so last time, so in 2011, there when East Japan earthquake occurred. So global supply chains were criticized because we rely on the part supply from Japan, and then some of the facilities in Japan stopped. Therefore, that impacted the production in the United States. But what we do not talk much about, what media doesn't talk much about, is actually in 2 weeks it was recovered. The reason is there are multiple, so the suppliers are diversified. So, and then they are all connected. So it could be, they could be complementary with each other. So overall, actually, global value chains, it is connected with each other. And then probably it's true that the hub and spoke system is not as resilient as all the networks connected with each other. And then the free trade agreement like CPTPP really helps to build that kind of resilient networks. Because then it would standardize the regulation for the business activities in those member countries.
I think the
So we haven't really.
Was there a question on
Victor, go ahead.
whether Chinese people support Xi Jinping? That's a bit off topic, but I will refer you to one of our websites. If you Google China Data Center or China Data Lab at UCSD, we have run kind of semi-annual surveys of, well, these are online samples, so it's a bit problematic, but the sample size is really large. And of course, with COVID, support for the Chinese government has gone way up, actually way up. Among some subpopulation, it was down a little bit in March, but by the June sample has gone back up to, ridiculously high levels, 80, 90%, something like that support. So on the face of it, there's a lot of support for the Chinese government, let's say.
Yeah, so the question here, the audience doesn't see the question. So the question was whether the Chinese people actually support these moves. And so the answer seems to be yes. Let me ask a final question, which is on Japan, since this is the Japan seminar. We haven't really talked a lot about Japan right now, other than Hiroki, you mentioned initially that decoupling is impossible for Japan. So the Japan-China relationship is complicated, right? It's very complicated, and there's the history portion of it, which is, complicated, and there's very little forgiveness there, and there's still a lot of mutual, let's just say, people are not comfortable, and then there's the business relation, which is much more pragmatic, as I stipulated. So are Japan and China, am I right on this? I mean, are they really friends when it comes to business and just nervous about everything else? Or how can that be an equilibrium situation? Do you have any thoughts on that, about what's China's public official line vis-a-vis Japan? And then Hiroki, what do you think is the unofficial sort of sentiment? So maybe I'll start with Victor. Do you have any sense of what the party line is on Japan these days?
I don't know, but the wartime guilt stuff gets trucked out when it's politically convenient. So I am gathering data on how often top Chinese leaders meet with the leaders of other countries. I don't have the complete database yet, but my impression is that the meeting with Japan is a bit, how should I put it, kind of formal. It happens like once a year, maybe twice a year if there's a G20 meeting. But with kind of true allies of China, like Cambodia, Pakistan, it happens more often. So you can tell by time allocation that China truly values relationship with some subset of countries on its periphery. And it makes sense, for strategic, but also maybe kind of ideological similarities reason that China is meeting with some of these countries more often than they would meet with Japanese leaders.
Hiroki,
Yeah.
I'll give you the final word. What do you think trade relations and between the, so is this as pragmatic and as kind of symbiotic as I make it sound?
Yeah, actually, China-Japan relations actually has been complex, and then actually even more complex in some aspect than China-U.S. relations. I think that we now forget after 4 years of Trump administration, we tend to forget how U.S.-China relations, especially U.S.-China relations, economic relations were before Trump, and then toward the end of the Obama administration, U.S.-China relations started becoming tense. But before that, actually, business relationship between U.S. and China were very strong, and then that actually the political relationship was drawn by very strong or cordial mutual the economic relationship. So very often if when business relationship business meetings between Americans and Chinese, they are very friendly, and then Japanese gave a little bit a more pessimistic view. So if you do if you make a relationship with China, you should be careful. The reason is Japanese businesses were affected by those history issue or rise of nationalism in China. So they really had impact. They influenced negatively the Japanese business relationship with China. And then Japanese business people, and then also Japanese government people, they knew about it. It seems that US business people, US government people, they did not have that kind of experience. So they had a very an optimistic view on China's economic rise. And China is entering the global economy, and that's actually all true. And then the Japanese were giving the United States a warning. And then for last 4 years, it's really changed. So the U.S. side, the pendulum, shifted to the other direction. So now the Japanese business people, Japanese government people are telling the Americans that, well, you shouldn't be so pessimistic. So Japanese position doesn't change much, and Japan-China relations are, in that sense, actually quite stable. It's quite surprising, I have to say that, but. Japan-China relations have been very stable in the meantime compared with the US-China relations. And I hope that the US-China relations would follow Japan-China relations, the very stable relationship between Japan and China. There are so many things Victor and I are both political scientists, so we know that many factors influence the bilateral relationship. But I hope I think Japan-China relations would be a kind of a front runner of the improvement of the US-China relations in the near future.
Well, I'm really glad I asked you this question because that's a really nice point to stop. Unfortunately, we have to end. Time is up. Always when it is the best fun, we have to stop. Thank you for joining me today, Professors Takeuchi and Shih. And audience, make sure you join us next week when we discuss SoftBank and NTT, KDDI, the Japanese IT industry, which is quietly, more or less quietly, setting up to be a major global player. So join us next week to learn more about that. And thank you, everybody. Stay well in these difficult times and have a nice Thanksgiving holiday, however you may celebrate it this year. Be well, take good care, and thank you, everybody.